Welcome, everybody, to Why We Need to Change How the Media Covers Traffic Crashes. We want to thank you so much for being here. You are doing very important work, and we know sometimes it's really hard. So you're busy, and we couldn't be more thrilled to have you spend your time with us today. I'm Melissa Ballmer, the founder of Petal Love, and I'm here with my good friend and colleague, Jim Brown. We did share a little bit about our bios in the email that I sent to you, but you'll learn more about us as we go along if you don't know us already. This class today is the last class in a year of classes that were hosted once a month for free because they were sponsored by Trini Willerton and It Could Be Me. And we are so honored that Trini gave us this sponsorship. And this is really fun to wrap up with this one here today. We are, if you don't know us yet, communications coaches for those working to create safe and sustainable transportation. And what we do is we teach you to use compelling storytelling and smart media relation strategies to create policy planning programs and infrastructure change. So to really get stuff done. And I'm not sure how Matt is getting into that, but I want to let you know, Matt, that we are going to share the slide deck afterwards, so you don't necessarily need to be drawing on it right now. That's kind of interesting. New. So our goal is always to help you elevate your story, and the media is one of your great tools because this is where you get out to a much broader audience than before. And it's where you get in touch with influencers and warm the room with the very people that you want to have help you create the changes you're seeking to make. So as we start today, we are going to share some housekeeping, and we want to make sure that you have a pen or a pencil or something to take notes with, and we'll answer your questions at the end. But right now, we're not going to stop to take your questions. So please write them down and put them in the text box, but make sure you have something to write your exercises with. And I'm going to stop my screen share right now just for a second to fix something, and we'll get back to it. There we go. All right. So let's jump in. Sorry, now we're going to freeze because it likes to do this when I jump out of it. It likes to stop. It likes to freeze sometimes. So here we go again. We've always got to have some little technological glitch. All right, we're going to try it a different way. Hold on just a second. Thanks for being patient with us. Okay, so if you haven't already shared who you are in the text box, please go ahead and do that. We'd love to know where you're coming from. We've got people from all over the country. Actually, we have people from all over the world with us today, which we're thrilled to have you here with us. So please go ahead and share where you're from. And as we start today, I wanted to tell you about the little survey that we did right as we started to do this. And this is one of the reasons why it was so important to share this presentation with you today and this research. Does news coverage of traffic crashes have anything to do with what the public thinks, who's the public thinks is to blame and the preferred solutions? We had 20 of you answer this. Thank you very much if this was one of you. But as you can see, one of you said that you'd read the research. 7 of you have heard of it, but you haven't read it. 1 of you downloaded our tip sheet, which we are very happy to hear about. 7 of you said no, you had only heard of crash, not accident. And I want to touch on that very briefly if you haven't heard about it before. About a decade ago, in 2015, Transportation Alternatives and Families for Safe Streets in New York hosted a social media campaign. It was a groundbreaking, fantastic campaign where they asked the Associated Press, who creates a style guide for journalists, which is considered the Bible of style guides for journalists, to use the word crash instead of accident. That was a great campaign. And 4 of you said, "No, I don't know what you're talking about. Tell me more." So what this made clear to us is that it was the time to share about this research and that we all need to learn more about it and how we can use it as part of our advocacy. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to talk about how the media covers traffic crashes now, by and large, and why it's a problem, how and why to reframe the issues based on the research. Jim's going to go more into the problem of passive language. Then we're going to talk about specifically what you can do, because we always like to leave you with very clear next steps. And we're going to share with you some real world examples of excellent coverage. So the coverage can improve, absolutely. So these are 3 headlines that I took from recent news media stories in the past year. And as you can see, these headlines are problematic because they are written as if the cars are sentient and they are the ones that caused the crash. When we're talking about communications, when we're talking about media relations, when we're talking about storytelling, we're always talking about framing. And framing the issues are so important because they help structure how people think about the problems and the solutions. And this is from a very interesting study, Factors and Frames That Shape Public Discourse Around Road User Safety. It shows us that we need to collaborate. So those of us who are in advocacy, those of us in the news media, in transportation, in public health and beyond, we need to coordinate so we can create better coverage. Everything we're going to share with you today, by the way, we are also going to share with you in the follow-up email so that you get links to everything. You have access to all of these tools and everything that we're sharing with you today. Yes, it is focused on the media, but these are things that also need to be changed in public discourse and especially with law enforcement. So progress is being made, but there's more work to be done. And I want to take 2 minutes right now. I asked you via email prior to the class if you would do some homework and look for a local story that was problematic. And so now we want to make sure that you start thinking about pulling that up if you did that homework. If not, we're going to give you time to check it out right now. But let's dream big for a couple of minutes. And if you want to share the story that you looked up, if you want to share local or regional, statewide, national, let's dream big. And in the text box, why don't you share with us the media outlets you most want to help improve their coverage? So who have you noticed? Let's take a couple minutes. Who have you noticed that's not doing a good job? Who do you notice that you want to help out and you want to get them moving in the right direction? And we like to do these kind of questions because it inspires us as we're doing media outreach, as we're creating media lists, as we're working with World Day of Remembrance here in the United States and doing media outreach. You might come up with some media outlets that we hadn't been thinking about. So we love it when you share your dreams with us and your ideas. We have just about a minute left. And again, if you already picked up a local or regional story that you find problematic and you want to share it with us, please put the hyperlink in the screen. And if you haven't, if you brought a story with you, but you hadn't pulled it up, go ahead and open up a browser window so you can get access to that. Remember, we want to do something local, something regional, but statewide and national as well. Which media outlets would you want to most help improve their coverage? We just have 25 seconds to go. We'll wrap that up and we're going to move on. Okay, so let's talk about the research because this is really important. And as we found out, so many of you don't know about it. So one of the research papers, the research that we focus on is from 2019. One of the research papers is from early 2019. One is from the end of the year. And the first one is editorial patterns in bicyclist and pedestrian crash reporting. Remember, we will share the links to this actual research with you at the end. Also, does news coverage of traffic crashes affect perceived blame and preferred solutions evidence from an experiment. So we created a tip sheet in 2020 and a toolkit that's the most popular thing on our website, and we're now in the process of updating that. And you will get access to the draft in process with a lot of wonderful tools. So there's 6 areas of problematic traffic coverage that they had in the research, and of course, using the word accident instead of crash is number 1, but you'll see that there's 6 others. There's also non-agentive versus agentive language, obscuring the role of a human actor, vulnerable road user versus a car, increases the blame for the focus of the sentence, object-based versus person-based, obscures the role of human actor, counterfactual statements, which we all really dislike, especially those of us who are biking and walking advocates, increases the perceived blame of the victim, and episodic versus thematic framing, which prevents the audience from connecting the dots between incidents and understanding the systemic solutions. So I'm going to drill down just into 3 of those to give you a better example of what the heck we're talking about. So object-based versus person-based, obscuring the role of a human actor, and those were those problematic headlines, right? A car jumped the curb versus a person driving a car hit and killed a pedestrian, which is what really happened. Most of us don't have autonomous vehicles driving around our streets, and most of the crashes, even in places that do, are from when people are driving, especially the really dangerous ones. Counterfactual statements increase the perceived blame of the victim. So things like the pedestrian darted into the street when it's only maybe the driver who's saying that. The pedestrian wasn't wearing a helmet. The bicyclist wasn't wearing a helmet, and the pedestrian was wearing dark clothes. All of these really have nothing to do with what actually happened, and we want to get both the police and the media to stop writing this kind of thing just to fill space. And finally, episodic versus thematic framing prevents the audience from connecting the dots between what happened and understanding the systemic solutions. So this is the situation where most crashes are written about as if they're a one-off, when usually what's happened is that that area, that road, that street is a problem. And so thematic would be, this is the 10th fatal collision this year. I'm going to turn it over to Jim now to talk about more deeply the problem of passive language.
Thank you, Melissa. University researchers Tara Goddard and Kelsey Ralph point to the common problem of news stories that are written in a way that obscures who did what to whom. And this often comes down to sentence structure, and specifically the use of what's sometimes called the passive voice. So I'm going to use my bachelor's degree in English here to quickly walk us through a little grammar lesson. Basically, the active voice puts the focus on the agent of the action. In other words, the thing or the person who is causing the action, whereas the passive voice puts the focus on the object of the action. And I'm going to give you some examples in a moment. We're so used to seeing and using the passive voice that we often don't even notice it. On the screen are some common examples of headlines about crashes, and you'll see they're all written in the passive voice. Pedestrian dies after being hit by a truck. It doesn't say truck kills pedestrian. It focuses on the victim. So now let's go to the next slide, and I'll give you a simple example of how this all works. So you've got the example in the active voice. You would say the chicken crossed the road. And my apologies to French speakers who might not recognize this particular expression. It's a very common English expression, American expression. The active voice, the chicken is the agent of the action. The action is crossing. So the chicken crosses the road. The road is the object of that action. And in the active voice, the chicken is the subject of the sentence. And that's important to know. With the passive construction, it's reversed or inverted. And in the passive sentence, the object, the road, becomes the subject of the sentence. Was crossed is now the action, and the one causing the action is now the object of the sentence. They are the agent. And in the active example, the agent is the subject of the sentence. The sentence is about the agent and what they did. In the passive example, the object of the action, not the agent of the action, is the subject of this sentence. The sentence is about the object being acted upon, and that's why we use the word passive. The object is passive in this situation. And there's one quick clue for recognizing passive construction, and that is to see a combination of the word of the verb to be with the past tense of a verb. So for example, was crossed as opposed to crossed, which is just a single word. So why does this make a difference? Well, readers typically focus on the subject of the sentence. So when the subject of the sentence is the object of the action, not the agent of the action, the agent gets less attention. And in other words, the passive voice de-emphasizes the role of the agent. So that was very complicated. We'll be sending out a cheat sheet to help you with it. And by all means, review the slides later if you want to look at it again. Next slide, please. Here's how that looks when we're talking about a traffic crash. So in the active version, the driver hit the pedestrian. In the passive version, the pedestrian was hit by the driver. And that's just what we saw in those various headlines. So as you can see, what happens with the passive voice is that it de-emphasizes the role of the driver. And the problem with that is that the driver is the actor who hit the pedestrian. The pedestrian didn't hit the driver hit the pedestrian, but this sentence says it backwards. So why is, next slide please. So why is the passive voice used? It's used to express objectivity or neutrality. It's also often used to avoid disclosing sensitive information. So you see it a lot. It's common, the passive construction is commonly taught in scientific disciplines, and it's often used also in bureaucratic settings. And you see it a lot with the way that law enforcement talks about things. Why is this problematic? Well, for one thing, it's wordy, it's formal, and it's less than clear in a situation where you actually want to be clear and concise. The other problem, and this is my opinion about it, is that it doesn't necessarily convey objectivity or neutrality. Obscuring or de-emphasizing the agent of the action by using the passive voice implies a point of view about what happened and who did it and what's important. And that's not either neutral or objective. Next slide. Here's a couple of examples. These are two news stories that both appeared on July 18th of this year. The first one is from Asheville, North Carolina, and it's about a bicycle fatality. The second one is from Philadelphia, Fox 29 TV in Philadelphia. Both of them use the passive construction in the way that they talk about what happens. The other thing to notice is that in both instances, the stories attribute the action to the car. There's no mention at all of the driver anywhere in the story. If you read the story, you would notice there's apparently nobody driving the car. So that's the problem. When researchers Kelsey Ralph and Tara Goddard looked at language patterns in 200 news stories in 2019, they found that 65% of the stories identified an agent. In other words, they identified the person or thing doing the action. But in 81% of those instances, the agent was a vehicle, not a driver. So this is something that active transportation advocates have complained about for a long time. because of the misperceptions that these kinds of stories create. And they're not wrong about this. This issue came up during the news coverage of the protests following George Floyd's murder in 2020. Next slide, please. So here is a post that the New York Times made on Twitter about the protesters, what was happening with the protests. And you can see that they selectively used the active and passive voices, and it was glaring. And readers noticed this and responded immediately. Next slide, please. And I'll just read these to you. Some of the reactions were fascinating how it's only the protesters who have agency. This is an example, this is a great example of how to use the passive voice to control the narrative, which is exactly what we're talking about here today. Does your style guide require you to reserve the passive voice for police actions, or was that your choice? This is a really glaring example. Next slide, please. The same month that this happened, in an article in the Atlantic magazine about the George Floyd protests, the author Sarah Jackson stated why this matters. How the news covers activism matters profoundly to a democracy because the media can influence public support or rejection of policies that might solve social ills such as racism and police brutality. Now substitute the phrase traffic violence for the phrase racism and police brutality, and you can see what Tara Goddard and Kelsey Ralph's research was all about. They measured the influence of the use of those kinds of terms. Next slide, please. So how, as champions for road safety, can we respond to the misuse of the passive voice? There's two things that I think we can do. First of all, we can be a responsive consumer of and stakeholder of the news. And what I mean by that is give reporters and editors your feedback about crash stories that obscure the agent of the crash by using passive construction. In other words, point out to them why the way they're writing these stories matters. And you can share the research findings and recommendations with them. And this is helpful. I've done this in a number of cases, and I was quite surprised. I actually got positive feedback. One reporter said, I'm printing out your tip sheet and I'm going to post it on my cubicle so that I remember these, because this is really good information. The second thing we can do, and I also want to add here, the specific recommendations in the research by Tara Goddard and Kelsey Ralph aren't particularly groundbreaking. They represent the basics of clarity and accuracy and completeness that are taught in journalism school. It's not our job to teach journalists how to write news stories. They're trained to do this. It's our job to hold them accountable and ask them to do a better job. The second thing that we can do is be aware of our own use of the passive voice when we're writing and speaking. Remember, it's a choice. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not useful. So you might want to ask yourself, what's your intention behind using the passive voice? Are you trying to clarify, or are you trying to obscure? Why are you choosing the voice that you're using? And where do you want to place the focus in the way that you're writing? Whereas journalists strive for and really should strive for objectivity, advocates get to take a position on things. So don't hesitate to express your perspective clearly and with authority. So that's a big argument for using the active voice whenever you can. So the last slide here is, so is using the active voice always better? And I just want to point out how the active voice relates to this question of agency and agentive language that Melissa pointed out in the research. As I mentioned, Kelsey Ralph and Tara Goddard found that 65% of all crash stories included an agent, but most of the time the agent was the vehicle and not the driver. I would say that in a news article that uses the active voice but gives the agency to the car is still a problem. In this case, a passive voice that uses that gives agency to the driver is preferable. So keep this in mind when you're writing and when you're talking to journalists. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Melissa.
Thank you, Jim. That was fantastic. So what can you do? That's why you're here, right? You want to learn about how you can make changes in your own community. And so remember, I asked you in the emails prior to the class, and I'm going to ask you right now, if you can open up your browser, if you already have one, do you have an article of local news coverage that is problematic? And if you haven't found one yet, let's take these 2 minutes right now to do that. So let's just take 2 minutes right now, and I want you to share the actual local media that you have found that's problematic, because this is your homework assignment. But we're going to start talking about what you can do here very, very specifically in next steps. So open up another browser window and look up your local news media that covers traffic if you haven't already, and share with us in the chat what you're finding. And go ahead and share good. So if you found a poor, if you look and you're finding that you don't have poor examples, you have good examples, go ahead and share, because we want to, the more examples we have to share with the media that it can be done, the better it is. So let's just take another minute or so now. Please share in the chat box whatever you found. You're looking for local, regional, and if you're statewide organizations, please do look for statewide. And if you're a national organization, of course, you can also look for national coverage that's problematic. Thank you for sharing them with us in the chat box. I look forward to seeing what we've put together here. So just about 30 seconds to go. And then we're going to get into what you can do now that you found this information. So share with us both problematic coverage and coverage that at least gets some things right. It's a process. You're not going to change the media all at once, and not every article is going to have everything perfect. So it's a growth process. Okay, so we're going to wrap that up, and now we're going to go on to what you can do about it. Obviously, you can read the research. And again, we're going to share the links to the research with you right after this class. You can study your own media landscape, which is what the homework was about, to get you started to look at your own news media and what they're saying. And then you can decide what you're going to do over the next, say, 3 months, 6 months, and a year, and set doable goals. And you can collaborate with your allies to make greater impact. So we have people from all over Colorado. We have people from North Carolina. We have people, I think, from Florida. So look for the people that are in your state that are also doing the work that you're doing, that you could collaborate with on some kind of media outreach for greater impact. So there are 2 approaches that you can take. You can take a broad or a specific approach. So a broad approach would be something like an open call to your local or regional media, could even be your statewide media. So this might be all of the advocates in Colorado getting together to write such a thing. Specific is that you connect with one reporter on one, or editor on one specific article, and you work with them to change their language in the future, hopefully leading to conversations that get that outlet to change their guides, if they have them internally, for the entire publication. So, and the 2 broad and specific approaches, let me give you some examples. A broad approach was Reconnect Rochester in Rochester, New York, who did an open call to their media via an email and a blog in April of 2023. They followed this up less than a year later by creating a media guide and hosting a breakfast and sharing that with their local media. Broad would be Bike Walk Nashville, asking their local and regional media to switch from the term accident to crash in their World Day of Remembrance advocacy goals for last year. And specific is the Bicycle Coalition of Greater Philadelphia, that worked with the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper to change their own internal guide. So depending on your resources, depending on the way the media is writing, you can decide whether you want to go broad or specific. This is the where Reconnect Rochester put their blog post where they put all of the information. And yes, you can't really, it's hard to read all of this, but a link to that is shared in the email that we're going to follow up with you because they have done a fantastic job. And I want to share two really interesting things with you about this. And that is that, oops, I'm going to go back to this for just a second before I go back to Jim. What I've learned from Reconnect Rochester and I've learned from Bike Walk Nashville is that they are making strides in helping the media change their language. And in both cases, this is really interesting and really helpful. The media is giving them better coverage for their regular ongoing policies, programs, and events. And that is what we want as well. So it's really a win-win. Jim, back to you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Um, I want to talk about the publication of a problematic news story as a teachable moment. I'm going to walk you through some steps to follow when the news publishes an incomplete story about a traffic crash. And this is based on a process that I followed during my 6 years as executive director of Sacramento Area Bicycle Advocates, which is the bicycle advocacy organization for the state capital region. Um, I was a stakeholder in those stories, and I treated the publication of those stories as a teachable moment by responding right away, usually within the first few hours of seeing a story. I would put everything aside to get going on this. And I did this because I knew how the publication of that story would shape the public narrative about crashes going forward. So here are the 7 steps that I recommend for seizing the teachable moment. The first step is explore the crash location using Google Maps, satellite, and Street View, even if you're already familiar with that location. And this is the way to confirm things like the number of travel lanes, traffic movements, including the location of driveways, the presence or absence of a bike lane, crosswalk, sidewalk, the presence or absence of traffic controls, the distance between controlled intersections, sight lines, street lighting, any relevant features of the immediate environment that could have contributed to the crash, because we know that so many crashes are influenced in part by the environment where they happen. And these are the details that rarely get included in a news story about a traffic crash. Also, confirm the speed limit. In Sacramento, the city and the county both posted lists of streets and speed limits. But if I couldn't find that, I would use Street View and travel up and down the street until I saw a speed limit sign so that I knew what the speed limit was. This is going to help me with what I'm going to do next. So the next slide is there's some more homework to do. If there is one, find and read the law enforcement press release, because that's usually the basis for the news story of the traffic crash. And you want to know what the newspaper or news outlet was using as a source. The other thing is to check in with your network to see if you have any connection to the victim. So for example, this could tell you whether the crash location was a place where they traveled regularly. That's also potentially a relevant detail. Next slide, please. Next thing I would do is I would call law enforcement that issued the press release to confirm anything that was not made clear in the news story. So for example, I would ask about the direction of travel, anything they knew about the driver's behaviors, were they texting, were they speeding, anything about the types of injuries. They're only going to talk to you about the information that they have released to the public. And part of the reason for that is a lot of this is still under investigation and they're just getting started. So they don't have a lot of information to share yet. But I wanted to make sure that I knew what they were doing. These were also actually, I tried to keep them amiable conversations. I wasn't there to attack or criticize or try to debate them about anything. I just wanted to get clear on what it is that they were doing. The other thing I'd ask about is the timeline for the investigation. How long is the investigation going to take? Because often a news story will treat we'll talk about the crash as if we already know what happened. And in fact, law enforcement will say, actually, we've only been on this for a few hours and we don't actually know very much, and it's going to take us, say, another month. That was pretty typical for fatal crashes in the Sacramento area. Next slide, please. Now you want to take what you've been learning and post about it on social media and really focus on the missing content, the contextual information, and the environmental factors. You're basically acting as a news source for your followers. So keep it factual, avoid speculation, avoid blaming or attacking. Explain the crash location from the perspective of a bicyclist or pedestrian. Address any of the counterfactual statements about things like color of clothing or whether or not the bicyclist was wearing a helmet. Um, the journalists who follow you on social media are going to see this. And often when I would do this after every fatal crash, and quite often that would prompt a call to me from a reporter to interview me about the crash. So it's a good tool for getting the attention of the media. Next slide, please. This is really the most, for me, one of the most important pieces of this is share what you know about the crash location, what you've learned about the crash location with local authorities, city council member, transportation director, public works director, anybody who can actually fix the problem. And I would ask for a meeting to discuss what I observed and talk about possible preventive solutions. And this is basic advocacy. You want to go to the people who can solve the problem and you want to ask them to help solve it. So next slide, please. Here is a tool I would use for setting up those meetings. It's a 2-page document. We're going to send you a PDF of both pages, but essentially what this document did was it was an overview of the crash. I kept a template on my computer and I would just update it with each fatal crash, and it had 3 parts to it. The first part on the left was some boilerplate language about what we know about fatal crashes, talking about fatality rate at certain speeds, the way that road width contributes to speeding and how that affects crashes. So basic things that we know about fatal crashes. The second piece, which is in the upper right side, I would talk about what I learned about the location of the crash, what I learned from looking at Google Maps and Street View. In other words, how many lanes did the street have? Was there a bike lane? What were the sight lines like? And the third piece of it was I laid out some possible ways to move forward with this. And these included things like recommending a community meeting to talk about the crash. I would suggest doing a walk audit to look at the crash location for ourselves and see what was going on. I laid out possible solutions, which could include things like adding a bike lane or adding some signage. I talked about perhaps revisiting the bicycle master plan or the pedestrian master plan to see if there were any problems there that could be fixed. I also suggested that we consider introducing a Vision Zero program in the community. And this particular document worked well. So in the instance that I give you on the screen here, I sent this off, arranged the meeting. I arrived at the meeting and I walk into this meeting room, and here sits a city council member, the transportation director, the assistant, the deputy public works director, a traffic engineer, a law enforcement. I think they were expecting me to show up with an army, and I was shocked, but we had a very good conversation. I thanked them for being so concerned about the problem and being so responsive to my request to meet. They actually unrolled a plan for what they were going to do with this particular street and how they were going to fix it. And they did that very quickly, and they fixed the street. So that kind of activism really produces results. Next slide, please. As we said earlier, this is the opportunity to follow up with the journalists who wrote the story and talk about what was missing from the story and why that's a problem, why that's problematic. It's your opportunity to share the research about these kinds of stories. I would also ask about newsroom guidelines for these kinds of stories and who writes headlines. You want to know how that process works. The other thing is to propose a visit to the crash location. Take a look, show the reporter for yourself to give the reporter a firsthand experience of what you're talking about. And finally, last slide is share all of this with your supporters and your allies and your strategic partners, for example, through your email newsletter. Share the research with them. What you're doing is you're encouraging them to be responsive stakeholders and news consumers. And the last thing I'll lead you with is, in case you're not convinced that the news media can actually get this right, here are some really positive developments that are happening in the local news in Sacramento. So when I was at Sacramento Area Bicycle Advocates, the Sacramento Bee, the city's main daily newspaper, had a dedicated transportation reporter, and he was very good. We talked regularly. Well, he retired. And then for several years, they just assigned traffic crash stories to anybody who could write them. And suddenly they were just basically reprinting press releases from law enforcement. And then at the start of this year, this past year, I noticed a dramatic improvement in the types of stories that were being written. And I contacted the reporter who was writing most of these stories, a woman named Ariane Lang, and I proposed that we have coffee. And in April, we sat down and talked about this. And she said she was a health reporter for the Sacramento Bee, but she was also a bike commuter. And she said she was really frustrated with the way they were covering traffic crashes. And she realized she could do something about it. So she went to her editor and she said, make me the transportation reporter, and I'll do a better job. And suddenly she started producing news stories with tremendous depth. Even crash stories, she would talk about all of the contextual information that was typically missing from these stories. And I asked her if she knew about Tara Goddard's research. She had never heard of it, but she knew that this is what would make these stories so much better. And then I started noticing another reporter at the same newspaper doing this, Elise Fisher, and that's the middle example here. What she does so beautifully is she takes the basic press release information from law enforcement and she just attributes it. She just says, this is the statement of the California Highway Patrol, for example. So rather than just regurgitating the press release as if that was what she had come up with, she attributes it all back to law enforcement. And that's a level of transparency that I think is really, really helpful and something that you can suggest when you're talking to reporters. The third story is really interesting. One of the things Ariane has started doing is to write obituaries about victims of traffic violence. As you know, normally obituaries are written about notable people in the communities, but she took it upon herself to write obituaries for each of these victims because she really wanted to explain who they were as people. That was information that didn't necessarily go into a news story. And she's written 5 or 6 of them so far. And this particular story is personal to me because that's my neighbor. Kate lived across the street from me. I saw her regularly leaving on her bike and returning from work on her bike. She was an avid, strong, confident bike commuter. She rode year round. The intersection where the fatal crash occurred is about 6 blocks from our neighborhood. And it's an intersection I've ridden through hundreds of times. So this was really personal to me. I think what Ariane's doing with these obituaries is fascinating and really, really powerful. The other thing she told me is I asked her about newsroom standards for writing these stories. She said there really wasn't any kind of guideline that said what she could write about and couldn't write about or how she would talk about it. That was really helpful to know. She also writes her own headlines, which is another thing that I thought was really interesting. In very large newspapers, it's the web editor that's going to write the headline that appears on the website. And very often they have not read the story and their job is to make that headline as clickable as possible. And that's why we see some of the headlines that we see. So the fact that she has control over the headlines also elevates what the readers of these stories gets from them. I'm going to share with you in our follow-up today, I'll share with you those 3 articles to give you the full flavor of what they're doing in Sacramento. It's really inspiring. And back to you, Melissa.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing the screen then, and we're gonna have a conversation, and we're gonna answer questions, and we're gonna go through your chat. I don't know if you've been looking through the chat at all, Jim, to see if there's any questions you want to pull up first. We've got you muted.
There we go. Sorry. I want to respond to what Todd just posted about police reports. Um, Tara Goddard and Kelsey Ralph and their colleagues have done this research about the content of news stories, and Melissa and I talked about it. The third study that they did in their series of research projects is called Intervening at the Blotter, Not the Broadcast, Improving Crash Coverage by Targeting Police Press Releases. And what they did was they went back to police press releases, and they've identified the same patterns in press releases that we see in the news stories. That shouldn't be a surprise if the news reporter is picking up a press release and regurgitating it as a news story. Everything that's in that press release is going to appear in the news story. So what they're suggesting is that we can also begin to look at how we work with law enforcement agencies to help them recognize that some of their editorial choices are potentially causing some confusion or misunderstandings about what happens in crashes. We'll make sure you see that research as well. I also see here, Todd, you were commenting about Google Maps. I completely agree with you about, Todd says here that you want to check the date of the street view or the satellite view because sometimes they're very old. Absolutely correct. I happen to live in a big city where that data gets updated regularly. I would say that using Google Maps is not a substitute for actually going to the site of the crash. If you can do that, you by all means do it. But in the first few hours after seeing a news story, when I wanted to get on this, get some conversation going, Google Maps was a pretty good way for me to get the basic gist of what's going on there. So your point is well taken. It's not always up to date, but in many places, it's going to give you enough basic information to be able to go to local authorities, to go to the news media and say, by the way, this was a 6-lane expressway. You know, very often that's a detail that doesn't even get mentioned in the story. They'll just say it happened on this street and this is what happened, but they won't tell you that it was a 6-lane expressway with a 50-mile-an-hour speed limit. That's a really important detail for explaining why the crash occurred, because a street that size is fundamentally different than a quiet neighborhood street. So thank you for pointing that out.
I want to share here that Kylie Robinson from Bike Walk, North Carolina, has shared a great tip to set up your Google alerts for keywords. Absolutely, Kylie. Yeah, shout out. So you want to come on, Mike, and instead of me reading this out and tell us what your tips are for that? Is
Yeah,
she still?
sure. So
Yeah, there you are.
I have Google Alerts set up for my email. So every day I get relevant articles, including those keywords. So that's been really helpful, keeping me up to date with what's going on in my community.
Kylie,
Fantastic.
I did the same thing in Sacramento, and I still get those alerts even though I'm retired now. Um, every day I get an alert about a story that contains those keywords, and a lot of the time it's not. I probably need to change the keywords a little bit to get better results, but that was the way that I made sure that I didn't miss anything. Because when I was covering this stuff as the executive director, I wanted to be on top of it. I wanted to jump into that public conversation. I wanted to initiate a public conversation about what got reported in the news and what didn't get reported in the news and what needs to be looked at more closely. That's a very helpful suggestion. Thank you for sharing that.
I want to jump to, and Severin, I'm not going to pronounce your name correctly here, but you have brought up something here that I want to expand on. So if you would come
Yeah.
on mic and share what you've shared with us here in the chat, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, so we basically in the organization Piéton Québec, which works in Quebec in Canada. So we basically did a media coverage and we took over some of the main communication guides, sorry, for post collision. Unfortunately, it's just in French, but I know that what I shared can be translated on Google. But it takes up a lot of the key points that you guys have mentioned throughout your conversation, your PowerPoints here. So I'm not going to repeat them. But what we added, what I wanted to add is that at the end of this communication guide, we did an interview with a local journalist who we noticed had already been applying these great recommendations. And he said that, well, the reason why he started to apply these recommendations that he discovered that there was a lot of collisions in Quebec that were being more and more reported. And because it's mostly like vulnerable users such as cyclists and pedestrians. And he told us that because these were being more reported, he felt that he needed to, report them correctly. And so I can quickly get over some great tips that he gave. First of all, before reporting the collision, which was really a reflection within his media, the media source, the media organization for which he worked, and was to sit down with everyone and be like, how do you want to report it? Which seemed, as you guys mentioned, there's no guidelines. So this was it was really revolutionary that they did that. And then he expressed that before reporting was really important to go on the field or use Google Maps when that's not possible, to also ask experts, so people who work within the mobility organizations as well, and to do checkups, to follow-ups, because what happens that sometimes there's a crash, but there's no follow-up reporting onto what happened to the person who drove or to the victim, or and then
Yeah, absolutely. This is fantastic. Thank you. So two things I
yeah.
want to jump on about that is the first thing is that I want to reiterate where Jim said he asked the Sacramento Bee reporter what kind of style guide they had, and she said they didn't really have one. So what we're finding is that it's hit and miss whether they have one or not. And so it's really okay to ask, like, what are you going by the Associated Press, or are you going? And remember, the Associated Press has only changed one word. There's a lot of other things we need to get the Associated Press to change as beyond using crash instead of accident. So ask the reporters where they're getting this from. And I want to follow up on what Severin was just saying here about having this reporter share in what they, be interviewed, because I've had Saul Gonzalez, who is the co-host of the California Report in California on KQED. So that's the NPR affiliate that creates a program that goes statewide throughout California. And when I was talking to him about this language guide recently, we're in the process to try to get his boss to take this up. He said, well, why don't you guys get the journalist organizations to host conversations about this? So imagine if you are in a place where you've got that reporter that is a champion of it, or several, and hosting a conversation for one of these press guilds, these press organizations in your city, and having a conversation where hundreds of journalists might come to talk about this. That might be a great thing to do. Jim, you have your hand up.
I just wanted to respond to what Severin had shared. Severin, I'd asked the Sacramento Bee reporter about time pressures, because I've heard that this can be a factor. In other words, television is reporting live from the scene of a crash. A newspaper, which normally in the old days might need 24 hours to produce a news story that goes out in print, is now under pressure to produce a similar story quickly for competitive reasons. And I asked her about that pressure, and she said, to be honest, she wasn't under that pressure. And she said, to be honest, it doesn't take much longer to be thorough in putting out a story. So I want to echo what you were sharing with us about the value of talking to journalists. And I guess the other point that I would make about that is that this can be an ongoing dialogue. Because, for example, Ariane Lang was not familiar with Tara Goddard and Kelsey Ralph's research. I shared that with her. That was important to her. I learned a whole lot about how the media works, because as an advocate, if I'm gonna try to influence the public conversation about these issues, I really need to know how the media does its job so that I can respond appropriately. So this kind of dialogue is very valuable for us in doing our jobs.
So I want to make sure that we've answered everybody's question. If anybody has a question, oh, yo, right here, Jeremy, you have a question. So come off mute and let us know what you want to know.
So this it kind of goes on what Jim was just saying about the kind of the quick turnaround of some of these news stories. I often see folks mention that, intoxication wasn't involved, or they bring up, DUIs that didn't seem to be the case, and it kind of takes the culpability off the driver. That could be the only reason this is, this could have happened. So if alcohol wasn't involved, it must have been the pedestrian or the cyclist's fault. It really takes the fault and the blame off the driver. I'm wondering if you have tips to kind of counteract that, or how to tell journalists what they could do instead. It seems like that line ends on every news case in San Diego. It kind of ends with that line. I'm sure it comes right from the press release of the police as well.
Jeremy, a couple thoughts. This is why I would call the law enforcement agency directly, right? I would call the California Highway Patrol office that issued the crash report, and I would ask them, do you know what the driver was doing? And they'd say, well, no, the investigation just started. We actually don't know. Mm-hmm. And I would say, yes, but you mentioned alcohol. Why did you mention that if it's not if it's not a fact that you've known? Sure. So it's important to verify those kinds of things. The other one that was a pet peeve of mine was the reference to bike helmets. In California, adults are not required to wear a bike helmet, and yet you would often see news stories about that mention the bike helmet. I remember I was being interviewed once by a reporter about a fatal bike crash, and he started off by saying, do you know whether the bicyclist was wearing a helmet? And I said, here's why that's not the right question to ask. I said, we don't know what injuries this bicyclist died from. If they were hit at 60 miles an hour, a bicycle helmet is not going to save them, and they probably died from massive trauma, not from a head injury. And so I think it's incumbent upon us. This is why we're recommending that you close that feedback loop, especially with the news. To your second point about or your first point about how quickly they need to produce stories, remember that when news is now delivered digitally, they can update that story every hour if they want to. And so one of the things I would recommend doing is, be bold and say, I think you should update your story and make that clearer, right? Don't hesitate. Again, you're a stakeholder. What they're saying has an effect on your work in the community. If what they're saying in their news story affects the public's perception about how big a problem this is, they could actually be undermining your efforts to make this problem a priority, right? So that's why the news coverage is so important.
Jeremy, you had some more things you wanted to say about that. Your hand's still up.
Oh, sorry, I can lower. No, those are all really great tips. Thank you.
Okay. Does anybody else have a question? If nobody else has a question that we want to go to, I want to ask you about what you think your next steps are going to be. So we've shared some ideas with you. Severin has shared another great resource. I hope you don't mind if we pick that up and put it in our links as well. And I want to, yeah, Severin, absolutely. It's to humanize news coverage. And this is one of the key reasons why we teach storytelling. We teach people how to do short, compelling storytelling so that they can include them in these news stories. So who is ready to commit to a next step? Who is ready to say what they want to do next? We're just about out of time, but I'd love it if you'd share in the text box, or if somebody wants to go on mic and share about where the next place is they're going to reach out to the local news media and see if they can get some of these changes to start to occur. Anybody have some thoughts on that? Or are you still kind of like, oh boy, this is a lot of information to take in? We know we've shared a lot with you today, but think about who you could reach out to next. And again, because we have people from several places in North Carolina that joined us today, people from several places, I think in Colorado, that are part of this. Who do you want to connect with? So, oh, okay, Melissa Ebel from Palm Beach, will you come on mic and tell us about what you're going to do? I love this.
Sure, yeah. So one of our local papers actually just recently expanded their transportation coverage. So they now have multiple reporters covering transportation. Their angle for that is that we are growing so fast in South Florida and traffic is really bad. And that's true, but we're going to use that as an opportunity to talk about a lot of the safety efforts that we're doing within our agency and to try to reframe that language that not just they use, but a link I shared previously was from a TV station. It happens all the time about, not using the right language and victim blaming and things like that. So we're excited to start that conversation. And he actually reached out to us to get that going. So we're looking forward to talking to him.
Fantastic. We're excited to see about that. If this has been helpful to you today, we hope that you'll leave us a testimonial down here because it helps us organize to keep teaching these kinds of classes. If there are things that you want to know next, share that with us as well. And also, if you are interested in being in touch with other people here who are working at doing this kind of work and you want to support each other, please go ahead and leave your name and your email address so they know that it's okay that they reach out to you. I'm going to leave this open for you guys for a few minutes before Jim and I debrief after the call. And there's some other great things here I want to read out to you that Kelly Norman from Carson area MPO planning an open letter to the media and an invite to a lunch to learn about the Northern Nevada Traffic Safety Summit. That is exciting. Send us an email and tell us more about that. This is absolutely what we want to hear. That's fantastic. John Eldon is saying, pushing this reporting agenda with my bike walk advocacy group. We have been successful in traffic calming in the city. So fantastic. That's fantastic, everybody. I'm going to step off and go mute for a little while. You can share your email addresses with everybody. The email should have gone out to you already with all of the links. The only link that is not in there yet is the one that Severin shared with us, which is absolutely fantastic. We're glad to have another resource. And thank you. We look forward to seeing you again soon. And we're going to send you notifications about what is going on with World Day of Remembrance for Traffic Crash Victims if you're a part of that and hosting events for that as well. So take good care. We'll see you very soon. And thank you for spending your time with us today.